Steve Elfrink, a pioneer with over 40 years of experience in psychedelic medicine and integrative healing, is the founder of OmTerra, OmTerra.org. In this podcast, Steve focuses on his groundbreaking hypothesis of psychedelic iatrogenic structural dissociation, which was recently published in Frontiers of Psychology, co-authored by Leigh Bergen. Drawing from his own deeply personal journey from a transformative yet destabilizing ayahuasca ceremony in a sacred southern Wisconsin valley to years of navigating dissociative trauma, Steve shares how these experiences led him to explore how psychedelics can deconstruct dissociative processes and potentially release trauma too quickly. With his expertise in legal psilocybin facilitation in Oregon and psycholytic somatic integration therapy using low-dose ketamine for PTSD and complex PTSD, Steve offers unique insights into the importance of cautious, titrated psychedelic sessions and somatic integration. Join him as he recounts his personal story, unpacks the science behind PISD, and discusses the transformative yet sometimes challenging nature of psychedelic therapy. Steve, welcome to the Rainforest Cafe. It's my
Hey, Dennis.
pleasure to have you on, my friend.
Yeah, wonderful to be here, Dennis. It's always a pleasure, any capacity to be with you. So happy to be here.
Well, you're too kind, really, but we've shared quite a few experiences over the decades, and when I think back, we've
Yes.
known each other now 10 years, 15 years,
I
something
think
like
it's like 15 years now. We're getting old and wise.
that's a long time, and you've gone through some changes, as we all have. You moved
Yeah,
from Viroqua, Wisconsin to Oregon,
yeah,
and you created a whole new career for yourself in this psychedelic therapy uh,
yeah.
role. And in part, was that motivated by your experiences with the dissociation? Uh,
Yeah. I think going back a little bit, like just the changes that, my life's gone through, I think for any of us who are involved in any level of psychedelic, exploration, change is part of the game. And different levels of transformation. And I think sometimes, those levels of transformation can be incredibly challenging and very dark. And, sometimes it's not all rainbows, puppies, and unity consciousness. But I think, there's value in all that. And then the key is, just really, the level of integration support, the level of really understanding what's happening. And I think for me, part of what happened in my life and in, all my psychedelic explorations was, a lot of challenging experiences, not fully understanding why, those kept happening. And then going through, a real challenging experience, with, that ayahuasca session that you know about.
mhm.
And so, yeah, today it would be kind of fun to just kind of explore some of these, challenging experiences. And then this, hypothesis, like you mentioned, that just got published on psychedelic iatrogenic structural dissociation, which is a mouthful,
Right.
but really helps start to frame, when people get into destabilized situations. Like for me, it was a year long with no real understanding, no framework. What I hope for with that model, that it's gives a framework, one, for anyone going through a very challenging post psychedelic experience, and also for practitioners who, have kind of a roadmap or, the framework to understand what's happening to this client who's showing up at their door incredibly destabilized and what to do with them. And for me, just awareness or having that framework can help a lot on just calming the system. Because I think what can happen in those destabilized situations is just a lack of understanding and, which just begets more misunderstanding and more chaos and more confusion and more overwhelm.
Right. Well, as we sometimes say, in a simpler way, set and setting is important. You have to properly structure the experience so it doesn't go off the rails, and particularly when you're dealing with these deep, transformative type of experiences. And I think you're perhaps not unique, but not all psychedelic therapists have seen it from the other side.
Yeah.
You've done both, so that is a tremendous qualification,
Yeah.
as sort of your credibility as a therapist, because you know what people having these spiritual crises, you know what they're faced with, and maybe how to resolve them. You've had to do it. There was no one when you underwent these experiences that was holding up a sign saying this go this direction. You had to figure it out for yourself.
Yeah, I've always been, I call myself a psychedelic guinea pig because also I could be like the poster boy for challenging experiences.
Right.
And for me, it all goes back to, all this, huge level of trauma I was dealing with that I had no idea, starting with birth trauma all the way up till, 23 years old. And trigger warning for this whole podcast, there may be your references to suicide, sexual abuse, nothing gnarly, but this huge trauma history that was just buried. And, something I do want to talk about today is dissociation. And then I want to go back to one thing that you said, Dennis, around set and setting, because it is mission critical. But even in like the perfect set and setting, because like my ayahuasca experience, which we'll explore a little bit, was the perfect set and setting.
Hmm.
The ideal situation, friends and colleagues, a trained ayahuasquero from Don Jose Campos, medicine from Don Jose Campos. So the perfect set and setting. And still, even with that, things can go south. And so that's
Yep.
the one thing,
It's
the
the perfect set
unpredictable.
and setting, except the set was not quite right. If the set is you.
Yeah, yeah. And what's also fascinating with that is my set at that time was solid.
Hmm.
And I had no, again, but I had so much buried. What's fascinating, this will be a good segue into dissociation, is just how much was buried and how much was under this like lid of dissociation, and then how much started to emerge. And then, but it was all this stuff I had no clue about, no awareness whatsoever. And that's why I was,
You were unprepared for that. That was the last thing you expected. Because
yeah,
you were
yeah.
experienced, you were a psychonaut, you'd had many experiences, although not with ayahuasca, not so much with ayahuasca, more
Yeah,
like,
I had, and did the, like 1,200 micrograms of LSD and 1,600, and not to
uh,
brag, and the 25 grams of mushrooms because I didn't know heroic dose. I knew there was a 5 in there. So I thought maybe it must be 25. So this is back in the early days. So a lot of experience with psilocybin, LSD prior to the ayahuasca situation, had like 3 ibogaine journeys under my belt. Experience with peyote, large doses of peyote, 5-MeO DMT, NN-DMT. So I considered myself an experienced user and, psychonaut, and very comfortable in those spaces, with friends, a lot of sessions, hundreds of sessions on my own, a lot of sessions of like ketamine, LSD combined together, all this just, trying to break through to the other side, but also in hindsight, trying to break away from, all the inner turmoil that was in my life.
and
So
did those experiences not help you to explore those, or did it effectively insulate you from retrieving those kinds of traumatic memories? I mean, I would think with, these what you really have to call enormous doses of some of these other things, it would have knocked something loose before, but it took ayahuasca to do that for
it
you.
was Iowa. I think it was a gradual descent, because I think what folks, when there is these levels of dissociation, you can like manage, 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 and it gets harder and harder. And for me, there was kind of this slow degradation of psychedelic experiences getting, tougher and tougher. because I started, taking LSD when I was 16. And then by the time I was in my late 20s, was starting to shift, but also had, a profound experience with a large dose of LSD that really changed my life of when I was a place of suicidality, and it shifted me out of that. But then I just found that, they're getting more challenge, my 3 to 5 gram doses were getting harder, and there's more panic coming in and more anxiety coming in. And it was just starting to get more difficult, which were, all little signposts of things to come. And even, I had to stop using cannabis when I was like 19 because I was getting so paranoid, and I just hated cannabis, and just very challenging, and ended up having almost like psychotic break from a cannabis cookie in my 30s, but was also a precursor for what I experienced with ayahuasca. So there was some of these little inklings, because that was like all about my head, the cannabis cookie. It felt like my head was being crushed. My eyes were popping out of my head. I thought I was dying. I thought I was poisoned, all from a cannabis cookie. But when we'll talk about this more, but like cannabis can break through dissociation very well, and all this stuff starts to emerge. But what I'd like to do, Dennis, is switch to kind of talking about dissociation and what, even with these, big doses of these different medicines, I wasn't getting to the, these big breakthroughs. I was getting little inklings of something was up,
Mhm.
but it wasn't, until really ayahuasca. And then, what another big thing that happened in my life, after that, quite a few years, was near death of my son, which I was also wasn't a psychedelic experience, but it was, my 18-year-old son is maybe going to die. So it was this very, very, in, crisis
Like
moment.
shamanic, dissociative perhaps, but
Yeah. So
yeah.
one thing I want to talk about, I want to, any questions on like history, and then because I do kind of want to segue and talking to or starting this conversation about the psychedelic iatrogenic structural dissociation. But any questions for you, Dennis, before moving into the world of dissociation?
Okay, well, they will come up as we talk about it.
Okay.
I want you to lead the conversation because there are certain things you want to be sure to discuss. So,
Yeah. This isn't probably in one of the more normal podcasts of any podcast on psychedelics, because it's deeper into the world of trauma, deeper into this thing called dissociation that a lot of people don't know about, and deeper into trauma, a whole different perspective on trauma and how it can show up in psychedelic sessions. So this paper, as stated in the bio, was that is published in journal or Frontiers in Psychology, was born out of this ayahuasca experience, and I'll go back to that a little more to kind of talk about what that was like. Um, but first, I want to kind of dive into this concept of psychedelic iatrogenic structural dissociation by starting with talking about what is dissociation, because I keep bringing up dissociation. And for me, it was the biggest key to understanding, my life. Because for me also, going way back, suicidal at age 4 or 5, I was suicidal, praying to God to kill me to my sleep. I had suicide attempts when I was 19, suicide attempts at 23. So there's all this why in my life, because I don't remember anything or anything. Just I was just very, very depressed, and I was always wondering why. And so part of like being the psychedelic guinea pig and going through, challenging experience, especially later in my life when I was just going through hellacious, even though the FDA psilocybin study of these hellacious sessions, but I just kept going because I wanted to know why. Why was I depressed? Why was I suicidal so early? So this path that I've been on, ended up in this world of going more of focusing on body, focusing on, what's known as fight, flight, or freeze. So just trying to understand a different perspective on body, because I was always focused on mind, insight, trying to, get the download or the insights and download the insights, all that stuff. And all these psychedelic experiences, I would have epiphanies, awakenings, non-dual realities, unity consciousness, but still the depression would live on. I would
okay.
have a peak experience and 6 months of great, maybe a year of great, and then the crash again. So this stuff would just keep emerging. So just in my relentless pursuit, got more involved with more like a psychedelic somatic approach. So using low dose psychedelics, I'll talk more about this later. And through the ayahuasca experience and through, further work, but more of low dose psychedelics, somatic, really starting to understand dissociation from the inside out. So what is dissociation? So we all experience it sometimes many times a day. And all this, everything, whether it's trauma, psychedelic experiences, there's a spectrum.
Mhm.
So there's a spectrum of dissociation. So dissociation can be as simple as just zoning out. You're staring out the window and just realize, whoa, where'd I go? So we can just kind of go into these little mini dissociative places. But what happens with anyone with trauma, and especially with young kids, and the earlier it starts, the more intense it can be as far as the levels of dissociation. And this, I'll keep brief, and we could spend 2 hours on this, just this topic right here.
Mhm.
But so dissociation is a protective mechanism. So what happens if someone goes, everyone knows about fight or flight. You're being
Right.
chased by someone and you go into fight or flight where heart rate increases, fast thinking, pupils dilate, and you're like, in panic or ready to fight. But that fight or flight filled with adrenaline.
Right.
But we can't sustain that. So what happens, there's some people know about fight, flight, or freeze. So what happens if that fight or flight, we can't sustain that. So the body goes to a point of overwhelm. So it's like, can't do this, I can't do this, because literally the body will die if it keeps sustaining that. So then the body switches into a dissociative state. So a freeze. And in that freeze state, it's actually an endogenous opioid dump. So naturally occurring opioids is about 7 different neurotransmitters equal to about 7 milligrams of morphine, which would be the equivalent to if you go to the ER with a chainsaw accident, they're going to give you about 7 milligrams of morphine. This comes out of Bessel van der Kolk's work. And so, but that dissociation is a protective place because you can't sustain what's going on. So you're literally go into this, I call it going poof. So all of a sudden you're there, and then all of a sudden you're literally drugged. So you can go into a moderate dissociative state. If the abuse starts getting worse, you can go into like a deep, deep dissociative state. And then you're just blank, numb.
This dissociative state, the fight, flight, or freeze reaction, uh, does that bear a resemblance to catatonia? Is that effectively what catatonia is?
Yeah,
Stress it so much, there's no choice, you just freeze.
yeah, you freeze. Yeah, but you're literally flooded with, you're in the opioid dump, but it's the body. So it's called, go from the sympathetic to the parasympathetic system. So, because when you're in that, fight or flight, blood's going tush, 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 and it's an evolutionary, function to go from, pumping blood out to shutting down the system. So what happens is, everything kind of goes cold. The brain memory function shuts down. This is a huge point. So just normal memory gets wiped out, but the body just keeps recording everything. And there's a famous book back to Bessel van der Kolk, how his body keeps the score. So, in a traumatic event, and a lot of people will say, again, the trigger warnings throughout this discussion, like someone, opened up a hotel room door and saw a guy standing there, and the next thing they know, the police are there. So what happens is, there's a traumatic event and then flooded with, the opioids, everything just shuts down, and that person can be just there and not there. And people talk, going through assault will say, I was witnessing myself in the assault from above, but they're just detached from their bodies. They're gone.
This
And
does not seem to be the most effective way to deal with a crisis situation.
it's a survival mechanism. It came in as a survival mechanism. It's a defense mechanism. And then where it gets kind of not wild, but more challenging is if it's a young child or even a baby, like someone like me who had birth trauma, the dissociation can start early and it becomes this imprinted, known, safe place.
Mhm,
So there's
mhm.
stress response. Oh, I go dissociative because dissociation is safe. It's comfortable because you're not feeling anything. But the challenge is everything that happened, because once, the body's recording, so if there's, that assault or whatever it is, but you've gone dissociative in that freeze place, the safe place, the body's still recording everything that's happening to you in minute detail. And then what happens though is all that lives on in the body. So for me,
Is carried as a somatic memory of some kind.
yeah, yes.
Yeah.
But it's all subconscious. Well, it's actually what's called primary conscious, which is, where all these, this non-rational, non-linear, timeless place exists, where all this stuff gets tucked away. And then if there's someone like with complex PTSD, which, typically someone with complex PTSD, it's, multiple events over multiple years. But all these multiple events over multiple years get tucked away, tucked away, tucked away in this dissociative place. But again, it's a survival mechanism. It keeps us safe. It keeps us protected, but it also, in the long run, starts to hurt us. Because what happens, bodies, oops, go ahead, Dennis.
Well, there's no way to it's suppressed, basically. I mean, it's still there. I mean, I would think it would accumulate and ultimately to your harm. The other thing that keeps coming up for me is if in your dissociative state, if there's an actual threat, a physical threat, if someone is about to attack you, freezing doesn't seem to be an appropriate reaction because you can't resist. I mean, they can go ahead and attack you, kill you, or whatever.
But it's at that point, just because the body can't sustain that fight or flight.
Right.
So it's only a survival mechanism. But then the challenge again is with a young kid, they can learn that so quickly. And then, but also other interesting thing with all this is the body seeks homeostasis.
Right. Right.
Body wants 98.6 degrees. Body wants to take in oxygen, get rid of carbon dioxide, eat the food, move it out, thermogenesis, all that stuff. But also body wants to process trauma. So all this held reactivity, held charge evolutionarily, if that's a word, back in the day, you're like, if say any animal, like a gazelle gets attacked by a lion, they tried to get away. Now they're being attacked by the lion. And so their point of overwhelm, they go dissociative, but then that lion hears hyenas coming after the cubs. So the lion leaves, but now that gazelle pops up out of that mild or moderate dissociative state into more kind of a fight or flight to get away, the flight. But then what the gazelle will do is then go off into the bush somewhere and they off gas all this like, you know, fear, panic, and all. So there's videos of these gazelles. I'm not trying to mock them, but their legs are going, they're frothing at the mouth, and all these sounds are coming out of them, but they're processing what happened to them. But with us and our big brains, all this stuff we don't process, so it just keeps getting packed in there and packed in there.
I see.
And then what the this is where I want to go into, so that's kind of dissociation in a very nutshell version of this defense mechanism. I can't even talk today. Defense mechanism system to protect us. But then this is where when I want to go into the paper, first of all, I want to mention the term iatrogenic. Everyone knows psychedelic, and then the next word, iatrogenic. And a lot of people don't know what iatrogenic. And in this paper, I'm using it kind of an expanded use. So I'm taking some liberty there.
Count me in. What does iatrogenic actually mean?
So it's a Greek word, and it comes from iatros, which is like healer, and then genesis, which is beginning or source. So it basically means harm from a healer. So, and it's used primarily in the medical world, a lot of times in surgery. If someone goes in and has an appendectomy and ends up with sepsis or an infection, that sepsis would be iatrogenic sepsis. So it wasn't there before, but it was created by the physician or the healer.
Okay.
And then, so it just means creating harm, basically. And I've got pushback saying, well,
physician initiated or healer initiated harm.
yeah, then so I'm kind of saying, and this is a little rub for some people, a little controversial, that the psychedelic is kind of creating harm. You're going within the intent of a spiritual experience or healing, but what's going to happen or can happen, what happened to me, what happened to a lot, definitely other folks, is they can go into this incredibly destabilized place. And a lot of times in that destabilization is suicidality and suicide. And so what's important to know, and I'm not saying like psychedelics are bad, what I'm saying is for certain people, they can be harmful. And a part of that is also if they don't have the framework of understanding, they don't have the support. Like in my year ayahuasca thingy, I was suicidal. I was very close to killing myself because I was so out of it, of this place of depersonalization and derealization, thinking I'm going insane. And then all this physical pain that I was going through where it felt like my head's going in one direction and my body's the other direction. So there can be harm. So and I know and I've gotten some pushback on that using iatrogenic, but sticking with it. And again, I'm not saying psychedelics are bad, but I just want to really bring awareness on one level that, for some people, psychedelics can be harmful. And it's a small percentage, but it's still a percentage.
Right,
So
right.
that's the iatrogenic. And briefly, we can talk about structural dissociation. So there's something I needed in the paper that is a kind of it's a therapeutic understanding model of with studies and science behind it around structural dissociation. And it's the closest thing in when I was going through my transitions and explorations, ayahuasca and forward of what I was dealing with. And it fit the bill the most. So structural dissociation is just tied to the simple thing where when anyone keeps going into these dissociative states, there's a part of them or a self of them that gets kind of, I call it cleaved off. So separated. So you have kind of a split. And it's not the classic like split personality or multiple personality, but it's basically where there's, for me, it was like that infant to 2-year-old Steve got split off. So that dissociation creates different structures, or what they call in their world of action items, which I don't agree with that term, but that's what they're called. But it's these different parts of us that just get, separated from us. So, and that's done again as it's another survival mechanism. So if, a young child is going through severe sexual abuse, physical abuse, but then has to go to school, has to go to church, sit at dinner next to the person that's their perpetrator, in order to survive, they have to take part of them and that traumatized part, or the one in structural dissociation theory, it's the emotional part. I just called it little Steve. They
Mhm.
have to get kind of separated. So they just kind of become this entity that gets pushed to the side. But that entity lives under this dissociative lid. So there's just this kind of split of selves. So for me, my life was there was Steve, forward facing Steve, and then there's all these little Steves since I had, trauma starting at birth up to literally 23. And
Well,
so
this obviously, I mean, could processes like this be at the root of something like multiple personalities?
I'm at the root, yes. In multiple, there's these extreme cases um, that, may be a little different, but I think so much is related to trauma. And also, like, I want to go back to something around dissociation and how, all this stuff. So back to the homeostasis part, where body is always trying to process this stuff. So what was showing up for me, like, as depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, uh, what I'd call being in the mud if I get in an argument with someone and it was overwhelming, and I'd just go poof. But body's always looking for this way to try to move this out. So, like anxiety, if someone's really anxious and just out, they call it general anxiety disorder. Excuse me. But there's just this, anxiety, and there's no reason for anxiety. But it's body. Typically, it's just trying to process what's in that. I just call it trauma ball
Right.
or that dissociative child. who, whatever that child's holding, even with that lid of dissociation, keeping everything safe, all that energy, all that held anxiety is always just trying to eke out. I call it off gassing. Like the analogy of if you had a balloon full of, just kept filling this balloon with trauma air or with trauma. And then, but how you take a balloon and, it's filled with air and then you squeeze the top and it just slowly ekes out of there. That's kind of like what trauma does. It just keeps on trying to move out, but it's slow and annoying and creates anxiety. And depression is, part of a moderate dissociation. But then, there's a process that I started working with that just allows big bulk movement of that, that energy to come out. So back to structural dissociation, another way to look at this is so with any of us with trauma, we start to, it's purely out of survival. It's a psychobiological thing that we've figured out brain wise and body wise. But we create these, another analogies I use a lot is just, there's the forward facing house, but then inside the house is all, the sub basement. And in the sub basement is another basement. And that's where like, this infant Steve lived. And this other room was 3 to 5 year old Steve. And then this other room was, 6 to 8 year old Steve. And none of those Steves know about each other. And I don't know about them as an adult. And that's how structural dissociation works, is that all these place or parts and, times of our life get separated from us, but they're constantly affecting us every day through suicidality, depression, anxiety, everything that, folks like me were dealing with. And then the adult trying to manage it all, not knowing this exists. Yeah.
Oh, it's a fascinating thing. This is really not at all what I expected, but it's very interesting. What keeps coming up as you're talking, I'm wondering, so the psychedelics can trigger this, but can they also heal it? Can they be used as tools to recover and recover all of these different selves from different stages of your life and somehow bring them back together into a whole single person that is healed? Because isn't that kind of the basis of psychotherapy and shamanic therapy to a certain extent?
Yeah, so what gets fascinating here is this is a great segue to psychedelics. So the world of, and this is something, one thing I'm grateful today, Dennis, is this opportunity to get the word out more about dissociation and how it works and how it can show up in psychedelic sessions, because it can show up in different ways. And I'm going to talk about 2 ways that psychedelics can affect someone like me who was, had all these different rooms with little Steves everywhere from structural dissociation and or psychedelics. And for some folks like me, psychedelic, session after session after session, no problem, because I've got a very strong ego structure. Got this like rock solid defense mechanism. Any of us with trauma, we build this fortress to protect the little ones. Because part of it, we don't want to go there because in there just lives, for me, sadistic torture, just hell runs. And so we do everything possible to not go there. And it's all or primary consciousness, timeless, non-rational, non-linear. So enter psychedelics. So 2 things can happen. I mean, 3 things. One, you can have a positive experience. I had many positive experiences. I had many, many, many very challenging experiences. But one, so you can have a positive experience. 2, there's something called the non-responder. So a lot of times the non-responder, strong ego structure, or not your time, or the trust the medicine thing, you're not ready for it, or you need more medicine. But a lot of times what can happen is that non-responder can be, in any of us with trauma, we sometimes live a lot of our lives in a different dissociative state. So that's what we get used to, and you can kind of sustain that. So what can happen, someone takes the psychedelic, there's that come up experience, like, whoa, holy shit, here it comes. But that someone with trauma and dissociation, sometimes that can equal, ooh, a stress response. I know what to do. I flood myself with opioids to get safe. So like for me, before I understood all this work, I could take MDMA, because MDMA is pretty sensitive to dissociation and have no effect whatsoever.
Hmm.
So I could take 125 milligrams of pretty pure, as pure as you could get, MDMA, do the booster, be with my friends. They're in it, doing it in a therapeutic container, and I'm 100% sober. And so what can happen is there's that come up, my brain know what to do, go into, this endogenous opioid. And so I've now flooded myself with 7 milligrams of morphine and wiped out the effect of or of the MDMA. And I saw this in my underground days with psilocybin, like, they've taken like 3 grams of mushrooms and there's no response. And give them a 2 gram booster and they feel a little high. I had a friend, doing ayahuasca. I saw someone, this same person, um, with ayahuasca just feel a little high, but not much. So the non-responder on the one end can be, this is kind of the better outcome. At least they're not getting taken out, which is the third option. But the one thing, where I want to throw out, because a lot of facilitators will, someone's a non-responder, just like I did this. You can keep upping the dose, but I've also seen and worked with clients who was with someone, no response, up the dose, and then maybe it finally starts to break through, but then it breaks through to too much, and that's where people can get destabilized.
Right, right,
Like,
right.
I recommend caution on upping the dose to non-responders in general. And I know, there's some of this will be controversial. People won't agree with what I'm saying, but I definitely err more on the side of caution of someone who's been through challenging experiences.
Right.
And so, any
Oh,
questions before I go to the third gnarly bad option?
yeah. So tell me about. I mean, it seems like, yeah, it seems like in the therapeutic situation, simply upping the dose is not necessarily the right choice for the therapist. If the person is a non-responder and you try to and you up the dose, so they're still a non-responder, and you up it more, clearly there's something going on that simply upping the dose is not going to fix, is not going to be helpful. Would a different medicine be helpful?
Okay, so you mentioned that up dosing, but you said
Well,
a
I was
different.
thinking, for example, a situation where someone is not responding to, say, psilocybin, and you up the dose and they're still a non-responder, and then you say, okay, let's hit them with DMT, or 5-methoxy DMT.
Mhm.
That's not necessarily something you want to do, but I can see where a person might think that that's just what they need. They need something to help them break through, but maybe break through to the wrong place, not where they
Yeah.
want to break through to.
And I know people have done that and have positive experience and helped people. So I want to acknowledge that, but also it's to me a little bit roulette-ish. And I know people will, like, if someone's a psilocybin non-responder, give them cannabis, which will typically cannabis, like in any substance, if someone's a non-responder, you give them cannabis, you're likely to break through. Because again, for whatever reason, cannabis can just part the seas of dissociation and
Hmm.
go on in. But there's where the roulette is too much too soon. And for me, if I ever, doing a psilocybin session, someone's a non-responder, I'm pulling way back and going deeper into, trauma history or trying to figure out what's going on here. But I do really extensive screening with clients and try to avoid that whole world. But I want to, and watching time here. So one thing I want to talk about when things go south and how psychedelics can create this iatrogenic structural dissociation. And that's where there's the extreme destabilize, and it's a spectrum. And, I lost, the spectrum is, it clears after a day of destabilization or 3 days to, suicide. And I lost, daughter's, my oldest daughter's what we call spirit mom instead of a godmother. Her husband committed suicide after a ayahuasca ceremony in Peru, where experienced user with mainly wachuma psilocybin first ayahuasca session. And I'm not bashing ayahuasca, beautiful medicine, But all these medicines, we got to be careful, and we got to acknowledge there can be challenging experiences. We got to acknowledge there can be destabilization. So that's someone who on the extreme end, they got so overwhelmed by what came up. And for me, that overwhelmed place is all of a sudden all those doors, that are holding these little ones, they can all get ripped open, or even if one of them gets ripped open, and all of a sudden these emotions come flooding out, especially if it's early childhood stuff.
Mhm.
Like anything 3 and younger than nonverbal is really hard to deal with, because what you've got is, someone like, say, birth trauma, severe birth trauma, or sexual abuse at an early age, which unfortunately can happen, me included, where that child they don't have, something really bad's happening to, say, a baby, and they don't understand even, such a primitive brain. It's not like this is, fear, this is panic, this is betrayal, there's no delineation of this emotional charge they're holding.
Right, right.
And so that can come up. So all of a sudden, and how psychedelics can work, they, break down the default mode network, which can, part of that can be, the defense mechanism. This whole system, strong ego structure that someone's built can get destroyed. It can be just the emotional availability gets amplified. It can, whatever, somehow it works through the dissociation and goes down in there. But now what you have is this access to those doors. And say again, if it's pre-verbal and it has no meaning to it at that age,
Mhm.
and that swirl of energy starts to come up, and all of a sudden it gets amplified by ayahuasca, LSD, name the psychedelic. So we know they're always amplifiers. Now you have this mind trying to make meaning of this place, and that a lot of times it feels insane, that energy, because you have this baby who's in fight or flight and under threat, and it's this feeling of insanity. And then, but the insanity gets amplified, and then there's the mind trying to make sense of it. So that's where it gets really tricky. But at any of these ages, it can get tricky. And so what can happen is, anything once that emerges, someone can be just totally taken over by that. Like, I think my friend who, committed suicide there, he was taken over by whatever age emerged in hindsight. And you think you're going crazy. So I want to kind of, this might be a nice bridge to kind of what I was experiencing from, and again, I'm not trying to pick on ayahuasca. And I respect your relationship with it. I respect anyone's who's listening to this, their relationship with it. It just happens. I mean, just whatever reason, that's what happened to me.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
with
In
ayahuasca.
in respect to that, can I ask you a question? Uh, you were in the clinical study of psilocybin at University of Wisconsin. That was after your experience with ayahuasca, right? Your dissociative experience with ayahuasca. That all happened after that. Is that right?
Yep,
And
that's
that's a
correct.
dose escalation study. So you
Yep.
took levels of psilocybin by injection that were calculated to be about as much as any sane person would take.
Yeah.
That was the point of the experiment, was to see what the level was, how high you could go in the dose, and you had none of these problems with psilocybin at those doses, or did you?
Yeah, so yeah, I'll go into that because it's a fascinating story. So
Okay.
one, I just want to, just for the record, it wasn't an injection; it was just pills. Like the classic.
Okay, okay. Well, don't let me, don't let me steer you the wrong way. I just wanted to
No, because I want to go to
out
that
yeah,
because it's all fascinating. I mean, that's where this, you know, I'm a great case study here.
right.
Those were very, very challenging experiences, and but not as challenging as ayahuasca. I think, I mean, I mean, a lot of the folks I work with, because I work with folks who have gone through challenging experiences, and it's rare for psilocybin for whatever reason. More common with ayahuasca, 5-MeO DMT. But even I worked with a client who took MDMA, well, and also LSD. Not but LSD is another common one. But MDMA wasn't working, and then took cannabis, and then broke through into the rooms of that one. So it can happen with any medicine, but I think what I've seen more often is ayahuasca 5-MeO are more destabilizing, or can be. And I
Mhm.
think that for whatever reason, they can go into that room better than other medicines, or those rooms. So I just want to watch our time here, Dennis. My ayahuasca story brief. I don't want this to be like trip report, but it's relevant to this. And also, I want folks who are destabilized to hear kind of some of the stuff I was dealing with, to maybe some recognition of, oh my God, that's what I'm dealing with.
Right.
One thing I want to as we're going into the kind of what happens to someone, I want to, like, anyone listening to this, there's nothing wrong with you. If you're in a destabilized situation right now, there's nothing wrong with you. And you're like, what, are you crazy? I'm losing my fucking or freaking mind. But what really helped me as I was going through all this, was understanding that it's a biological process.
Is this?
Your body's trying to process this trauma. It's trying anything possible to move it out. But it can be very challenging. It can be overwhelming, but starting to just understand that there's a path through. You're not going crazy. You're not insane. You're having, this challenging experience of your body doing everything to process this. You're having a biological response to your past. So for me, what happened, so the actual ceremony was beautiful. So I did 3 nights, the classic 3 nights with ayahuasca. And again, veteran to all these different experiences. Had done ayahuasca before, but I wasn't an experienced ayahuasca user. This would have been my first, second. My first dose of the 3 nights was my third time with ayahuasca.
Okay.
And the first night, somewhat uneventful. I didn't go back for a second dose or anything, but manageable. The second night was the big night, but it was the same dose I had the first night. But it was classic ayahuasca. It was, I had, lots of snakes going through me. It wasn't freaking, snakes through my nose, snakes through my mouth, snakes going everywhere. I was playing didgeridoo during the ceremony, and snakes were coming out of the didgeridoo. Shamanic battles with three hyperdimensional entities. It was a condor flying over the Andes, and I was supposed to learn what's the Shipibo language? Quechua?
Quechua.
Quechua. I was supposed to learn that. I mean, it was like a beautiful experience. But for me, it wasn't. I was always interested in more healing, more deep work. And, my God, I got it. But so I rolled through that, and then the third night, some nausea. I never purged, but it was like wanted to, but it was, not quite there. But I rolled through it like, okay, pretty cool, but beautiful music, and just the setting, that setting. Beautiful place, and with my friends, and puppy piles after session, and beautiful, and wonderful food afterwards. So it was all a beautiful experience overall. I mean, some challenging, but nothing like I've been through so much more challenging than those 3 nights. But
Right.
for me, what's fascinating here was a week later. So I made it through, and then a week later in Verocco, Wisconsin, in November, raking my leaves like you do, and all of a sudden I just started to feel like, that the come up experience where, like, kind of feels like I just drank a cup of ayahuasca. So a little, like,
Mm.
nervous rush coming up, and I just like, huh, maybe it's like with ibogaine, how it kind of like says hello, maybe 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, the next day. So I just sat down and kind of just moved through. Wasn't a big deal. But then this is where my life changed. That night, I was talking to a friend, and all of a sudden, I couldn't really understand what they're saying. All of a sudden, I start to feel this like, here we go. And I tried to talk, and I couldn't really talk. And then I made it up to my bedroom. But by the time I got to my bedroom, my body is starting to, like, not convulse, but shake. And then all of a sudden, this is where I got the first experience of where it felt like my body was going in one direction and my head was being pulled in the other direction. And this physical pain of my head being pulled off from my body, and then the panic of my head getting pulled off and the pain from it, and then the terror to beget the panic, and et cetera, et cetera. So, and this was something that would happen anywhere from, like, that lasted about 4 hours. And then for about 9 months, I would go anywhere from 3 minutes to 8 hours of this experience. And it was out of the blue, but also I started to experience something that's common in structural dissociation and destabilization, something called depersonalization, also derealization. And this is where I knew I was Steve, but I wasn't sure who Steve was. I knew I was on planet Earth, but I wasn't sure what planet Earth was. I also couldn't, like, I would see my kids watching a documentary on dinosaurs. And all of a sudden, just seeing dinosaurs, I'd just be like, panic attack. And but part of me is going, I'm an adult. Why am I having a panic attack of about a dinosaur? So there's this place of this destabilization. I also think of the pilot in Oregon who, took mushrooms. It was all in the news. The pilot took mushrooms and then like 3 days later tried to crash a plane. Because he was a pilot himself,
Mm-hmm.
was in
Mm-hmm.
a jump seat and took the controls and tried to like crash the plane.
Right.
Like, but he was saying, I wanted to find out what was real. And there's this place of this derealization, depersonalization. You don't know what's real. And it's kind of crazy making. But what happens to these folks, what happened to me, and what I was dealing with, I'm going to kind of cut to the chase here. But for a year, I was looping in birth trauma. And so I was forceps delivery, a breach, flipped by three men, forceps delivery, pulled out. A forceps delivery is where they go into the birth canal and grab you by the head and then pull you out with these forceps. Then born with, I got my birth records to confirm all or discover all this. Birth cord around my neck, or the umbilical cord around my neck, and APGAR score of 3, 1 to 10, 10
Mm-hmm.
a baby, 3, not so much. Had to be resuscitated the next day, intubated and resuscitated. So I had this incredible traumatic birth, but I was like looping in that for a year. Oh,
And
so
this,
there's,
this was not all the time. This came and went.
it came and went, but
Came and
what was
went. Right.
what was there to different degrees was this depersonalization, derealization,
Mm-hmm.
thinking I'm going insane and think I'm going crazy, and also never knowing when else I'm like, here I get taken out. And I had friends like if they got a 911 text for me, I'd have someone come over because I got to a point, something like in 9 months, and I'm dealing with this still, and thinking I'm going crazy, thinking I'm never gonna get out of this. I'm gonna lose my mind. I'll never be normal dad to my kids. That's where like the suicidality at 9 months, there was one day in the shower where that kicked in and being ripped in two and it's getting worse. And I'm reaching for the razor blade because I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I mean, it got to that level. And then, but the place, it's just this yeah, again, I'm repeating myself, but you don't know what's real. But what's happening is what gets weird is, and the way I started to understand this through time and doing more sessions, it's from a somatic approach and more low dose controlled, is you're looking through 2 or 4 sets of eyes. So here's adult Steve, at that time, 52-year-old Steve, looking through the world, but also I had infant Steve who got awakened from one of those, sub-basement rooms, and I've got a baby looking through. So that's where that depersonalization, derealization. So I'm like, the baby's, sees the dinosaurs panicked, and I'm don't know why I'm panicked because of the dinosaur, and it makes no sense. But you
Right. Right.
can't make sense of reality because you have 2 personalities. You have 2 personas, you have 2 Steves. And it's crazy making and it's awful. And for anyone out there dealing with that, I'm so sorry because it sucks. It's one of the worst places to be. But there's a way through. And then for me, ironic, and I'll get into the psilocybin session. Um, what was, I would, in all honesty, if what happened to me, which was serotonin syndrome, if that didn't happen, I doubtful I'd still be here because it was getting so bad. And it was just getting the session, the things were getting worse that was coming out of me. But I ended up finally at like month 9 going on Xanax and a SSRI.
You mean these high dose psilocybin sessions?
No, no, no. This is still ayahuasca.
Okay. Okay. But you were having serotonin syndrome?
Yeah, from SSRI. I was on. I know this is hard, maybe
Oh, I see.
hard to track all this, but yeah, it's because the things from the ayahuasca depersonalization, derealization were getting so intense, again, in month 9 now of dealing with this and no answers. I mean, you were probably one of the best helps, or you're saying, Steve, you're going through a shamanic initiation. But those words always stuck with me because I'm just like, okay, I don't understand this, but something's happening here.
Mhm.
I never thought I was crazy, crazy. I just knew my body or something's working through here. And I just kept trying to trust it, trying to trust it. So your words helped me, Dennis. So thank you. But what happened, yeah, so I was put on an SSRI because I just got to this point, I can't handle this anymore. I will kill myself. And so I really wanted the Xanax, and I told the doctor I'm having panic attacks. Got Xanax, SSRI. SSRIs made things worse, so they put me on SNRI, but they didn't do a taper. And so I ended up in serotonin syndrome and nearly died, which I don't need to go into the details of that, but one of the worst experiences of my life was experiencing serotonin syndrome, where short story, but felt like at one point my head was going to explode in 1,000 shards of glass as my face is ticking, my whole body's convulsing, and I was thinking it was from ayahuasca, but it was the serotonin syndrome. But that moment, the intensity of the headache, the intensity of these thousands of shards of glass exploding in my head. When that happened, I thought I died. I blacked out. I came to, and first thing I did was this of touch my face to see if I'm still here. And I was, and called my doctor, and he's like, "Oh my God, my bad. Should
You
have
know
tapered
this was
you."
serotonin syndrome, or did the physician know that this was serotonin syndrome? How
You know,
did
the physician, when I talked to him, he's like, "My bad. I should have tapered you. You could have died. Cease all medications."
you know,
But what happened is that, brain explosion kind of reset my brain, but not in a I never recommend if someone's destabilized from psychedelic induced serotonin syndrome to break yourself out of it.
no, I wouldn't recommend it either.
Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that at home, kids. But it shifted something, but then I had 3 months of depersonalization, derealization that started to fade. But then I knew there was something in there. I knew I aborted what was trying to, because I'm not a big, I use trust the medicine with caution because it can get kind of scary. And, but I knew something was trying to work through. And I'd had various diagnoses in my life of bipolar and depression and general anxiety disorder. And I always just knew there's something else here. So yeah. So the reason I got into that psilocybin study is I knew there was something in there. I knew I needed to go back in. I knew, well, one, I wanted to be part of an FDA study because I thought that would be, as a psychonaut, something important to do. So, but my main mission was to hopefully complete what happened from the ayahuasca experience. And I knew it was going to be challenging. I knew it was going to be possibly very challenging, but I was hoping it would be the answer, or it would work through whatever didn't get completed from ayahuasca. But it just really challenging experiences. And, first dose, and it was, escalating doses. We were looking at pharmacokinetics. So blood serum levels, all that stuff, EKGs, blood draws. And people would say, well, probably challenging because you were having blood draws and EKGs, but the blood draws were probably one of the better parts of it,
Yeah.
because the blood draws, those became like the sacred blood angels would come in and take my sacred blood, which was going to the sacred lab. And then the sacred, technicians there were analyzing my sacred molecules and the sacred psilocybin molecule. And this is going to help, millions of people. So that was the beautiful part of it. And the rest of it was just incredibly challenging. Very, very challenging. But I had on my third dose, this could be a whole other podcast, but the third dose, very, very, very challenging. Human suffering, every person who's ever suffered channeled through me. This black hole abyss of screaming souls, every scream channeled through me. I mean, it was very intense. And then personal suffering, worst, the most wretched, despicable, awful soul, parched, no food for 40 days, no water for 40 days, and then take a sip of water and I would die, and then resurrect, and then suffer, sip of water, die for 2 hours, after 2 hours of human suffering. But then, not to go into trip report, but I did have probably one of the most profound experiences of my life on that third dose, a life-changing experience of high indifference, where I was above human suffering, above unity consciousness in the stateless state. So a very profound experience, but it didn't get to the root of my trauma. So what's fascinating, Dennis, is so that, I mean, incredibly, especially that the last 2 hours of that place of high indifference, because was in and out of non-dual states for a while after that, and it just, with no eyes, there's no suffering, and I was at the top of my game, and that's when I, launched the first version of OmTerra, doing the psychedelic therapy symposiums. But what I found is I kept, even after that experience where I thought, and I also discovered at that time that I had birth trauma, and then the ayahuasca thing made sense. And I thought I like cured everything between, discovering that was birth trauma. Oh, that's what happened during that ayahuasca session. Then everything I went through, all these suffering, and then this final peak experience, I thought I achieved the magic goal. Because, for a year plus, no suicidality, no depression, no anxiety, but then all that started coming back. We can wrap this up. Because one thing I want to just go a little bit into is how how to work through this stuff. So, because what I found from that psilocybin experience, very profound and very beautiful. That third dose, again, I thought I was cured, but then all of a sudden everything starts popping in again. And at this point, I kind of got, I was pretty involved with the underground world, seeing some bad things going on, starting to get a little disillusioned with psychedelics because, okay, I've done like everything someone could do, including, FDA study, every known psychedelic combinations of not some of the designer stuff, but, and all of a sudden here I am again. The depression's back, suicidal ideation, intrusive thoughts, everything is back. And but I was in this relentless pursuit of why. So that's where, I think I alluded to it a little bit at the beginning of the podcast of starting to discover, okay, I'm blasting out. What's this monkey thing called body? What's going on in there? So that led to discovering, it was actually from OmTerra, the third conference. Again, these were psychedelic therapy symposiums. Now I've got OmTerra as a therapy organization. Original version was therapy symposiums, which I'm still grateful for you, Dennis, for being part of that. Having some deer or venison chili and that whole experience. Still one of the warmest, most beautiful memories of my life were those first two, especially the first two symposiums. So it was pure magic.
Yes, they were. They were great symposiums. Yeah. Yeah. So,
So like those beautiful things were coming, but then there was also this depression, everything. So back to somatic. So what I got involved with was starting, took a deep dive into psychedelic somatic world. And the one person I started working with was this gentleman, Saj Razvi. And again, this could be a whole podcast just on this, but it was what I discovered was first understanding fight or flight. And the first time I saw what was called the ANS map, the autonomic nervous system map, that explained, stress, mild stress, fight or flight, and then dissociation, the symptoms with dissociation equaling depression, suicidal ideation, heaviness, all the stuff I was experiencing. And then the anxiety as the state, what's called state two. And then again, the whole podcast could happen on this, but it was the first time I saw framing of what I was experiencing as a biological phenomenon. And it was like, okay, so I've gone everywhere possible up there into the spiritual realm and mind and insights, and I'm going to explore body. I'm going to go in this other direction. So I started doing these sessions, which really just focus on this activating the autonomic nervous system through like low dose ketamine or a little bit of cannabis, but it's just really to get the mind offline. And then something called selective inhibition. And this work comes out of, this kind of rambling on this, But it comes out, I want to give acknowledgement to Peter Levine. A lot of people know Peter Levine, who was one of the early somatic guys. And then Eric Walterstorff, who was one of his proteges, PhD students, who really refined this model of accessing trauma through the body and using something called what Peter Levine called containment, what got renamed by me and my partner, Saj Razvi, selective inhibition, business partner. But it's just reducing all standard coping mechanisms. So basically, you're taking low dose ketamine and you can't move. So most of us, 1,000 times a day, we touch our face. We're always just fidgeting, trying to take a deep breath, calm down, all that stuff to try to not go there into those rooms. So we're always off gassing. We're always trying to reduce anxiety, calm ourselves down. But this process, you're going the opposite direction. So it just really takes you into body. And if you're reducing or inhibiting everything, all of a sudden body's got to move somewhere. So stuff starts to just, all these sensations starts to rise up, come out of the bedroom or those sub basements. But it's in a much more controlled environment and very small doses. It's like a 45-minute to an hour session. But it's a place to get direct access to those rooms. And so right now that's the primary model I work with, and 98% of my clients, that's the model I'm working with. And I do, some psilocybin work, but primarily I'm working with low dose ketamine is probably my main go-to right now, and this body focused approach to really access these sub-basements and allow this energy, this held reactivity, these held emotional charges to come out in this very contained, very safe protocol. So questions on that, Dennis? I know that was kind of rapid fire, trying to watch time here.
This is quite a data dump, Steve. You have not shared this story with me. This is absolutely fascinating.
It is
Some
fascinating.
ways sobering. I mean, because people don't realize. I think people can be very cavalier about psychedelics. I mean, I know I have been, and I've paid the price, and
Mhm.
people do. I mean, it's a two-edged sword.
Yes.
It's a technology like anything else, and they in the right hands, in the right circumstances, they can be very healing, but they can also be quite dangerous. I mean, listening to you, describe these experiences, I'm thinking, what the fuck? I'm never going to touch these things again. Jesus. And of course, that won't be the case, but I've
Don't
never
recommend
had
that.
these kinds of, the kinds of experiences that you have, and
Yeah.
now as I get older, I think, well, I'm not in the best of health. I have heart issues and all that. I, I I'm still comfortable with ayahuasca, but
Yeah. Oh,
at low doses, and ayahuasca's never been threatening for me like it has been for you.
yeah.
But I can see how it could get there,
Yeah.
and it's and I mean it's a tool. It's important to use this medicine to plumb these spaces. I mean, it sort of goes back to the old Jungian idea that we're trying to achieve, integration of some sort. What was the
Yes.
Jungian terms? You know, integrate these different parts of the unconscious,
Yes.
and
Definitely.
they are tools for that. But the territory is not. It's not just a bunch of happy hippies dancing in the park. You know.
No. And I want to add in, like, I'm extreme case, like the level of trauma that I went through, like for the therapist I ended up working with, and I'm a big fan of IFS. I should throw that in. So the model I work with now is a mutation of what was called PSIP, Psychedelic Somatic Interactional Psychotherapy, which is this trauma-based model to go into trauma. But I've shifted it to kind of really bringing in IFS, bringing in more of this understanding of parts, understanding this level of structural dissociation, these little ones. So it's a much from where I started, it's a much more nuanced model, a much, for me, my opinion, safer model, slower model. And that's and I did hundreds of sessions on my own, had also with my therapist. And, for her, she was 25 years in doing trauma work. I was her number two most severe trauma client. Number one was from a satanic sex cult. And the level of trauma, I was number two most severe. I'm not saying this as a bragging thing or anything, but I want to add, so like the level of trauma I went through was equal to the number of challenging experiences I had and the severity of the challenging experiences.
Mhm.
I only touched on a few of my challenging ones, but there's many more. Um, so I'm abnormal. And again, I'm not ever trying to say don't do psychedelics. I'm an advocate for psychedelics. It's my life. I owe my life to psychedelics. I wouldn't be here without psychedelics. But I think my biggest message here as we're kind of wrapping up is be careful out there, folks. And again, like I had, I was successful in the world, a VP of sales in my corporate days and all this. I had no idea what I was holding. And it gets so tucked away, and it depends on, I call it supercomputer. So, kind of a cursing and a blessing, but I figured out a way to survive these awful, awful places that, or these things that were done to me, and with no clue. So you never know who that client is in front of you. And so kind of just ending on this, like the screening thing is super important. And so like I turn or a lot of my psilocybin, consults, and for whatever reason, like most people, like a lot of people that come to me are, tried everything, nothing's worked, the
Mhm.
real people. But to take them into psilocybin, maybe not the right answer. And so for me, the screening thing is really important to start looking for any levels of dissociation. And for me, and I do really extensive screenings, I do like,
Right.
I don't charge for consultations, and I really, because I want to go really deep with that client.